FPL Game Week 7, a free hit draft and a wildcard draft, with some of you looking to change up your teams this week and target teams like Manchester City against Brentford, Manchester United maybe against Sunderland, but of course Arsenal at home to West Ham if you don't own them. These two chips can definitely be played this week. We're going to talk about other opportunities to play them and the drafts if you were to go with them in Game Week 7. What is up, everyone? FPL Harry here. Before we dive in, 2,000 likes is the aim. Subscribe if you are new to the channel, and an extra upload for you on a Tuesday morning. We're going to do our best to keep this nice and short, but we're going to look at both a free hit draft and a wildcard draft for you. We're actually going to start off by talking a little bit about the 4 chips, and if you haven't played any of them or you haven't played some of them, when are other opportunities to use them, and maybe when am I looking to play these chips in the upcoming game weeks. Starting off with the wildcard. To be honest, you can play the wildcard in any week, depending on when your team looks good or your team looks like it needs a few changes. But I do think there are some weeks which look better than others, depending on fixture swings for certain teams that you're looking to target. It remains that game week 13 is probably my favorite week to play the wildcard. If you can save the chip that long and your team looks fine between now and then, there are big fixture swings for Newcastle, Manchester City, and Liverpool looking good. And we might look to jump off some of our Arsenal and Chelsea players at that point. So if you can save it until game week 13, that is probably the best time to play it in my eyes. And that was my plan until my team needed it sooner in game week 6. Outside of that, game week 7 and game week 8 both look good. We will look at a wildcard draft this week, but I do prefer it in game week 8. Game week 8, there is more of a fixture swing back for the likes of Liverpool. You can also have a look of jumping off Aston Villa if you have them at home to Burnley this week. You probably don't want to sell them, but you probably don't want to include them on a wildcard if you're looking to play it. So I do prefer game week 8 to game week 7 because it's also the international break and you get a couple of weeks to plan. You get to see if anyone gets injured over international duty. But if your team does look like it needs it this week and you don't own much Arsenal, game week 7 can definitely be a possibility. A few other weeks, game week 12 works similarly to game week 13 again, just like game week 7 and 8 do. There are fixture swings around then for Manchester City and Liverpool. You could go a week early in game week 12. That is another option. Game week 16 is where we get the African Cup of Nation transfers. So to be honest, I don't think you need to be saving your wildcard until after that. And if you're saving it until after that, you're suddenly going to have a load of transfers for game week 16, which you could roll through the potential wildcard. But if you're going to have to start using some when they come in game week 16, and then you're having to wildcard to make even more changes while still having 5 free transfers, I think you're better off playing your wildcard before game week 16, even if it's game week 15 or 14 or 13, as we've mentioned. And then when game week 16 comes around, you have the ability to hold some of those transfers for the longer run until some of the doubles start to arrive in game week 25, roughly, which is what we got last year. In terms of the triple captain, if you haven't used it, there are a couple of weeks like you could play it on Haaland this week against Brentford or at home to Everton next week. But generally, if you haven't used it now, unless you want to punt on someone like a Chelsea player or an Arsenal player, waiting until about game week 12, 13 onwards is probably the best strategy. Erling Haaland in particular has quite a few games. I think he's got West Ham at home, Leeds at home, Sunderland away, and another one, maybe Sunderland at home between now and the end of the window in game week 19 when you can play it. There are lots of good opportunities. Mo Salah also has some really nice games before he goes away to the African Cup of Nations. My personal preference at the moment is Haaland at home to West Ham in game week 17, but let's see how they get on, the new West Ham manager Nuno, over the next few weeks, and whether I'd be comfortable triple captaining Haaland in that fixture. Next up is the bench boost. This is the one that is the most team dependent. So there are options in game week 7, 8, 9, 11, depending on which of the cheap options you've gone with. All of those weeks have a decent enough fixture for Dubravka, who's likely to be your backup goalkeeper if you're looking to play the bench boost. But it might depend a little bit on who your cheap options are. All of them, in terms of Sunderland, Burnley, and Leeds, have a good fixture in game week 8. Sunderland have Wolves at home and Burnley play against Leeds. But if you have quite a few Everton players, they go away to Manchester City that week. Game week 7 actually works quite well, depending on who some of the cheaper ones you've got. You might have defenders who look quite good for DEFCON this week. And actually, because of some of the defenders looking good for DEFCON, even a more difficult fixture, it feels quite easy to play the bench boost in pretty much every week. I'm sure there's people who wildcarded in game week 6 who got quite a lot of points on their bench, whether it was a Rodon, whether it was an Alderette. So there were lots of good opportunities, but I would look, if you've already wildcarded 7, 8, 9, and 11, if you haven't wildcarded, you could save it to play after that. And the final one is the free hit. This remains the weakest of the chips because there are no blanks and double game weeks planned between now and game week 19 when you have to use all of these chips. There is a very small possibility that we might get a blank and a double around game week 17. If Crystal Palace win in the Carabao Cup next round away at Liverpool, there is a very small chance. So my plan is just to wait in case that happens. It's still less than a 10% chance. Very unlikely that even if Palace do win, that is going to happen, but it is possible. And then you just save it and play it in a week where maybe you get an injury to a key player who's just out for 1 week, or you have a week where your defense doesn't look quite as good, or you just save it until some of the Christmas periods, or let's say there is a weather postponement like there was last year. Unless there is specifically a week that your team looks not so great, I would just save it until maybe 15 to 19 and play it in a week that maybe doesn't look quite good for your team, or if something unprecedented happens. So we're going to start off by having a look at the free hit team for this week. And I do think if you're on free hit, you need to try and do something a little bit different to maybe what the general crowd is doing. And that is, at the moment in this draft, going with a triple up on Aston Villa. Now, they've been really disappointing until this week, but they do play Burnley at home, who are rock bottom for expected goals conceded so far this season. Rodgers finally got a return, as did Ollie Watkins. Now, be careful because they do play in Europe midweek, so keep an eye on that. And of course, keep tweaking your free hit drafts and your wildcard drafts depending on any news we get from European fixtures and in the press conference this week. But I have gone with Martinez, Rodgers and Ollie Watkins because a lot of people wildcarding are going with none of these, so it's a bit of a differential factor. I've also tripled up on Arsenal. I've gone with Gabriel, Saka and Gyökeres. I think long term, the double defense is maybe better than going with a double attack. But if you're looking to target a fixture on a free hit, you could go with this. Now, if you didn't want to go with Saka and let's say you wanted a Manchester United player, that is probably the big deciding factor of whether you should do it on a free hit or not this week, is should you go with Bruno Fernandes? Should you go with a Brian Mbeumo at home to Sunderland? I've opted not to, but I understand if you would want to and still trust them. I might if I was playing it, but I understand the majority of you watching will tell me, no, you don't want to do that. And I think that's fair enough. So I've gone with Gabriel, Saka, Gyökeres. I've gone with double up on Manchester City and Haaland. Reinders, I have got double up on Bournemouth. It is a difficult game at home to Fulham, but Senesi's great for DEFCON, and Semenyo just looks like he wants to get points every week. And the final one is Dan Burn at home to Nottingham Forest. Good for DEFCON, a nice, reliable option. There are a few other options in the Rodgers and Reinders place that you could look to change it up. I think outside of that, I'm pretty happy with the way the squad is set up. You could look at a Minte. He goes away to Wolves and has been very impressive. You could go for a Caicedo at home to Liverpool. Almost certain to get good defensive contribution numbers if you don't trust Reinders. Away at Brentford, you could have a look at Doku. Of course, at Manchester City, another option if you wanted to triple up or go with him instead of Reinders for 1 week. If you had the money in your draft to go up to Phil Foden, or you look at Everton. But they're at home to Crystal Palace. You could also go for Crystal Palace, but they're away to Everton. That feels like quite a difficult game to call. So I feel like I've punted on some games that I think are slightly easier to go with. Again, this is it. This leaves me enough money in the bank. It has a pretty cheap bench. If you needed more money to build this team, you could, of course, do Xhaka down to King of Fulham to free up a bit more money and take even more out of the bench. Haaland, of course, with the captain, if you wanted to differentiate a bit more, Gyökeres, Watkins, Saka, all ones to consider, but I wouldn't be betting against Haaland. And then we're looking at a wildcard draft. And just to talk about a few things which are maybe slightly different to what was in the wildcard 6. So I've gone with Pope over David Raya in goal. I just like what Pope offers. He's good for bonus if they keep a clean sheet. They aren't scoring that many goals reliably for all the attackers to get bonus points. So that is quite good. The upcoming fixtures for quite the long term look solid. They have defended very well so far this season. And David Raya is always a 2 and a 6 pointer. I don't regret going David Raya on my wildcard, but I do like the idea of going Gabriel, Saka, Gyökeres, partly because of the squad structure that Bukayo Saka allows. Now, if you still want to go with Bruno Fernandes on your wildcard, which I would say 90% of you watching will tell me that going with Bruno is a crazy thing to do and I shouldn't have done it in game week 6, and that may be the case, especially if he loses penalties, you could do Saka down to Bruno and do Pope up to Raya, but then you are very similar to the game week 6 wildcard, and you've probably not gained that much unless you, of course, triple captain Haaland in game week 6. So we've gone with Gabriel, Tarkowski, Senesi, Richards, which are 4 of the back 5 that I went with, but we've downgraded Anderson to Alderette. Sunderland do look great defensively, and he can just sit last on your bench, pick up some nice defensive contribution points, and not be bad going forward. Saka, Semenyo, Reinders, and I've gone with Ismail Assar with Xhaka. If I could have my wildcard again, I would go with Xhaka over Stack. And then it's João Pedro, Haaland, Gyökeres up front. I know João Pedro hasn't had a shot in the last 3 games, but from game week 8 onwards, the Chelsea fixtures look incredible, and I would want to go there. If you prefer an Enzo Fernandez, you could do João Pedro to someone like a Calvert-Lewin and do Xhaka up to Enzo Fernandez. That is also possible. A few things that you could look to change there. The Ismail Assar position is also up for grabs. You could go for Kudos. I've already mentioned Enzo Fernandez. You've got Minte, Paqueta, who could also come in for Reinders if you wanted to punt, or in for Xhaka. Declan Rice, but you've also got triple Arsenal, so you'd have to drop someone there, or you triple up on Manchester City and you go with Doku, who I've been very critical of the past, but does look very good. This team also sets you up very nicely for a potential bench boost in game week 8. You only have one Everton player at the moment in Tarkowski, who goes away to Manchester City, but almost certainly gets DEFCON that week. You do have Dubravka playing Leeds. You've got double up on Sunderland at home to Wolves. It looks pretty nice for game week 8 bench boost if you still have that chip available. Of course, you can still wildcard with this team, even if you don't still have the bench boost. Haaland with the captaincy, vice captain on Gyökeres if you were to wildcard this week. So that's a bit of an idea. It is really setting up a DEFCON defense. You don't need transfers there too much. And then looking to build in some Arsenal, Manchester City, maybe a bit of Chelsea. I wouldn't go without Chelsea. I would go with João Pedro or Enzo Fernandez with their upcoming fixtures. Semenyo picks himself. And then it's really what you want to do with the Reinders and Ismail Sarr spots in your team. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up there. I am recording just before there is the kickoff and the lineups coming out for Everton versus West Ham. Fingers crossed for the Everton players to give me one final boost this week. But wildcard has started well, but I could do with some points on Monday night. So let's see. We'll review all of that in my team selection video, the transfer targets videos later. Thank you all for watching. 2,000 likes is the aim. Subscribe if you are new, and I'll be back again very soon.